Hello, everyone, and welcome to Kinky Sex, Learning the Ropes. See what we did there? At FtBCon3. Kinky is a term that gets thrown around a lot, but what does it actually mean? In this session, we're going to talk about the basics of power exchange, fetishes, and all the different ways that you can relate with others and or have sex, but might not have imagined before. We will also talk about how to get involved in the kink scene, and how kink intersects with other matters of sexuality, such as polyamory and being queer. So what we'll do to get started is I'll go around the horn and give a quick bio for everyone. Then they can fill in any blanks and or engage in their shameless plugging, and we'll get started with the panel. So first off, we have Hina Databoy. Hina Databoy spent their childhood as a practicing Muslim who never in their right mind would have believed that they would grow up to be an atheist, feminist, secular humanist. Hina has been an active participant in atheist organizations and events in and around Orange County, California since 2007, and on the national stage since 2011. They are currently writing a Skeptic's Guide to Islam and blog at freethoughtblogs.com/heinous. Sheba is the Deputy Executive Director of Poly Columbus, actively poly for over a decade. She is an activist, community leader, and educator, sharing her knowledge and experience with groups and students at events and colleges around the country. Together with Barack, she owns AIS, Adventures in Sexuality, one of the largest pan-poly BDSM groups in the Midwest. Danny Samuelson is a writer, avid feminist, and armchair philosopher. He was part of the tech industry until 2010. He's now working on his own business ideas, writing novels, and toying with board game ideas. He loves physics and astronomy. Finally, we have Dan Williams. Dan, along with his wife Dawn, are the authors of Living Master Slave, a book for masters, slaves, and their relationships, as well as creators of the wildly popular Kink Starter Cards. They are co-producers of two unique events, Power Exchange Summit and, along with partner Karen, Beyond the Love. They are also the co-hosts of the Erotic Awakening Internet Radio Show, an educational podcast that explores all things erotic. They are featured educators on both Kink Academy and Creative Sexuality, and mentioned a number of books, articles, and other media. So, Sheba, starting with you, anything you'd add to your bio and or want to make certain people know about?
Well, I want to make sure that people know about the two huge events that AIS runs every year. The first one being Winter Wickedness, which is happening in just 2 weeks right here in Central Ohio. They're huge 600-person kink events where we have two evening parties that last all night and a day of educational classes on everything kink. The next one we do is in September, and that one is called Cope. You can find out all kinds of information about either one of those events at our website, which is adventuresinsexuality.org. We also do a monthly podcast called the Kinky Curious Podcast, or BSing with Barrick and Sheba, and we are hosted by the Erotic Awakening Podcast Network.
Awesome. And for those who don't know, COPE is Central Ohio Perversion Excursion. So, all right, next up, Dan, anything you'd add to your bio, stuff you want to plug?
What was that you mentioned?
Dan. So, sorry. Disambiguate.
No, apparently mine is quite lengthy there. So I think you pretty much covered everything, except for, well, when I was 5, I first started. Never mind. We'll leave that for later.
Okay. Danny, anything you would add?
No, I feel a little outclassed, but no, nothing I would add.
Ina, anything you'd like to toss into the mix and or plug?
Well, I'd like to say that while I don't primarily identify along kink lines, like that's not the main thing that I do, I've more than dabbled, I guess. Yeah, feeling a little outclassed too, but...
All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. And I think it's important to define some terms. There's a lot of, for those of us, and I include myself as somebody who dabbles at most at this point, it's important to understand what it is we're talking about. And one of the terms that's often used is BDSM. So does anybody have a definition of that they want to give for that term?
BDSM is actually an umbrella term that's used widely by kinksters and by vanilla folks as well. And it actually has a lot of different meanings depending on the letters that you choose to put together. The BD could be bondage and discipline. The SM could be sadist and masochist. It could mean master and slave. So it just depends on which order you put them in or how you identify as to how you use that umbrella term.
So how does the umbrella term BDSM differ from kink, or are they completely synonymous?
In my mind, they are completely synonymous. BDSM is just more of a long stretch of words that have to fly out of your mouth when you try to describe what it is that you do with your partners to express yourself sexually. And it's much easier for me, and I think for others, to just say, hey, I'm kinky.
Mm-hmm.
I would say there's a difference in terms of the BDSM seems to have more of the power exchange elements to it.
Mm-hmm.
Generally, when you hear BDSM, you're assuming there's someone on top and someone on bottom and things like that are going on. Whereas I've heard people talk about kinky play and they just mean things that aren't traditional sexual activities.
Yeah, I think there are elements of kink in the really modern kink culture that aren't expressly sexual too. They're parasexual in that they're related to sexual actions or sexual experience, but they're like, kink does not have to be sex. It does not have to be something similar to, leading to, or following sex.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there are things that people colloquially describe as their kinks, and they could be, even things like going to a library or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But BDSM is almost inherently bedroom activities.
Mm-hmm. So, Hina, you mentioned the phrase power exchange, and Dan, I think you might have written a book on this. Can you kind of give us a brief definition of that phrase?
Absolutely, and the tricky part here is that people use, and it's really funny, we're defining kinky and BDSM and all that stuff, and as you travel around the nation, you'll find we have decided that the terms mean something else somewhere else. So apparently kinky people are not into dictionaries because there is no consistency, unfortunately. In general, when we think about power exchange from a relationship perspective, we're talking about something outside the bedroom, outside the dungeon, where for myself, I have a power exchange relationship with my wife, Dawn. I am in charge of the relationship 24/7. We like to say she takes care of me, I take care of the relationship. So it is not a peer-to-peer relationship, it is a clear hierarchical relationship. Sometimes we'll use the terms power exchange in kinkland as well, and that's where it gets a little bit funny, but for myself, the power exchange relationship has to do, sometimes we use terminology like master-slave, dom-sub, other lifestyles have other names as well, owner-property, and you can go, there's just all kinds of fun ways you can tour up that language, but there's the brief view of it.
Okay. Anything anyone else would add to those definitions, and or the one definition I've got on my list that hasn't come up yet is switch.
Hey, I'll chime in there since I call myself a switch. I'm not greedy. I just like everything. The reason they say switch is because I go back and forth between all of the terms that have been mentioned so far. I have been a submissive. I am currently a master. I am frequently dominant. But mostly I just really like to play a lot, and I like the energy that I can gain from it and the energy that I can give to others when I'm playing. And whatever form that happens to take, depending on the person or people that I'm playing with, I just go ahead and follow that energy and go with it. If that takes me to someplace on the bottom of the power exchange, that's fine.
I am also a switch, and for me it's somewhat similar in that it's the context is far more important to me. The person I'm playing with is far more important to me than any particular role, and I'll sort of assume it as I go, essentially, whatever works in that situation.
So kink is kind of a relatively broad term, and in my head, when I think of the subject matter, I kind of mentally subdivide it into two large categories. We have the fetish category, or non-traditional stimuli, so having pain or having something that people would not normally think of when it comes to sex or pleasure. And then the other major category is power exchange. How do our distinguished panelists think of kind of the lay of the land when they hear kink? How do you kind of divvy it up or think of that general universe?
For me, my kink for me is something that I do to express myself in a sexual connotation. Power exchange for me is something completely non-sexual. I am currently the master in a power exchange relationship that is based on Victorian ethics, and my girl, Spanky Ray, is my submissive and is my servant, but she is not my sexual partner.
Any other ways that people think of kink as an umbrella term, or kind of start subdividing that or making mental sense of the different terms and ways that you relate?
Well, for myself, if somebody, it's important for me to recognize that kink is a pretty broad term. It's pretty general. That it really doesn't tell me anything except for perhaps you do allow yourselves some alternative sexuality. Now, for some people, kink is as simple as me and my significant partner. We're monogamous with each other. Every once in a while, we break out the silk ropes and I tie her up, or I make her call me daddy, or maybe we mix in a little spanking or something like that. Or we might watch porn together, and that might be our kink. The challenge is not to find too much of a box to put this in. What we're finding is that the world of kink is getting bigger and bigger and wider and larger, and this goes back to why BDSM is no longer a great term anymore, because when someone says they're into BDSM, it may well mean that they're into I've met recently some furries. They say, oh yeah, that's a form of kink for us. And I was like, really? That doesn't sound comfortable. But what do I know, right? So for me, kink is the beginning of a story. It's never the end. It says, yeah, I'm alternative. I practice some level of alternative sexuality in some way.
So something else, that really struck me as very important to talk about is the role of consent. So just put that out there. Who wants to kind of give their view of the importance of consent to kink?
We normally consider a good definition for consent to be consent is not the absence of a no. It is the mutual co-creation of a yes.
As much as kink might not look like sexual expression, parasexuality is still sexuality, and consent is mandatory, especially when you're dealing with anything where it could be feasibly dangerous in some way, whether it's restraints or whether it's striking in some fashion, or some of the more dangerous like knife play or play piercing or hanging and that kind of thing. Without consent, then you end up in a situation where the person who is receiving especially does not know how to be prepared for things. So it's incredibly important to seek consent at every stage of anything you're doing. Without it, you just risk people getting hurt and having a bad time, and that's not what sex should be like, even parasex.
I would add to that I've been thinking a lot more about contextual consent, because there are situations where people may not be prepared for what's going on or things like that. But I'm sure we can get into that when we talk more about events and things like that in public play.
So let's go ahead and talk about ways to get involved. And one of the frequent hubs is FetLife. So does anybody want to kind of give us an overview of FetLife for someone who's never heard of that?
If you missed the good old days of arguing on the internet, whether Picard or Kirk would be the better captain, then you need to head over to FetLife and get your arguing on. It's your standard internet hub. It's they like to call it Facebook for kinky people, and there's a lot of value to it. It's important when you go there to recognize it's a standard. Like I said, it's a standard internet hub. If you post, "Hey, is it okay for me to choke my wife?" on Sundays while we're at church, someone will vehemently tell you it's the stupidest thing ever. Someone else will respond by saying it's perfectly rational and acceptable, and somebody else will say, can't we all just get along? That being said, if you understand it going into it with that eye, it is I want to say at this point of the world, it's the way to connect with other kinky people. You could head over to OkCupid. You could head over to Collar Me. I think it's still around. There's a couple other sites, but at this point, when we go into a convention, if Dawn and I go in and teach a class and we say, how many of you are on FetLife? If there's 30 people there, 29 of them are going to raise their hand, and the person that didn't was taking a nap. It's where any event that you're interested in is listed, where any munches, groups, local people, local communities, a wealth of wonderful information can be found there as well. It really breaks down to that opportunity to really find out a lot about your local community, but also the broader kink world in general.
I would add that. Sorry.
Go ahead.
In terms of FetLife, I would say that the problems with FetLife go far beyond people having petty arguments. FetLife is home to a lot of people who engage in a lot of kinks that I think sort of go beyond the pale. You know, there are white supremacist groups who claim that's their kink and they love black slaves. There are horrible misogynistic groups that say, well, we are male dominants and so therefore we view women as inferior inherently. There are a lot of racialized fetish people who come on to me without my consent, if we were going to talk about consent, both in kink spaces offline and on, and FetLife is really a cesspool for that. There have been a lot of trends on FetLife. Like if you click on the trending stuff on FetLife, it is nothing but white skinny women for the most part. So there's not a lot of diversity. A lot of the notes that have trended, some of them are very questionable consent-wise, and these are not erotic fan fictions. These are true stories that people tell. So I honestly am only on FetLife so I can find out about events, but I honestly find it to be incredibly problematic and not a safe space for a woman of color.
Yeah, I think that another great way to find other people who are into kink in your neck of the woods is to simply go on Google and put in the little search bar kink or BDSM and the name of your city. For sure, things are going to pop up that tell you about FetLife, but other things are going to pop up as well. For sure, different groups in your area are going to pop up. There's a great way to meet people by going to meet and greets or munches that are listed out there on meetup.com. There's a variety of ways that you can find out what's going on in your community.
So real quick, Sheba, if you can define munches, and then I want to double back to Danny and Hina on some points, because we've had that term come up twice, munch.
Okay. Munch is a term that's been used since probably the early 50s by the gay men's groups who started meeting for the purposes of getting to know one another in a leather context. Named after a little place that they used to go meet out in San Francisco, Munch something or other. It's a little burger bar. And it just kind of spread throughout the country as I'm going to a munch. It's a place where I can meet people who are into kink, who are into leather, who are into SM. Now we traditionally like to call them meet and greets because it's a lot easier to understand what a meet and greet is versus asking the question that you just asked, Neil, which is, what the heck is a munch?
All right. So, and Danny, you had a thought that I think was coming in at the same time as Sheba. So, what was the thought that you had a few minutes ago?
It was to talk about the culture at FetLife, but this is a problem with a lot of internet cultures in general. That I'm a pansexual man, and pansexual and bi men in general have a difficult time on FetLife, just like they do anywhere else, because we're not gay enough for the gay guys, and we're not straight enough for anyone else. And I've gotten a lot of harassment on FetLife, more harassment on FetLife than I have in places like OkCupid and even like Collar Me, because I identify as pan. And that kind of thing is a huge detriment to a lot of people who aren't like straight cis white people on FetLife. Like everyone else beyond the straight cis white people with their standard kind of kink outlay will encounter problems on FetLife just because of the cultural context that FetLife exists in. It's not really FetLife's fault. It's the fact that we live in a kind of awful world with its own kind of problems. But it is important to acknowledge that harassment is a problem on FetLife.
So the question that I had for Hina, and I'll put this out for the panel as a whole, but I especially want to hear from you, Danny and Hina. What other venues are you looking at, or what is it that you're doing to make that particular aspect of FetLife suck less?
I hit the block button constantly. I don't even look at Kinky and Popular anymore because it's so disheartening. I don't look at my feed very often. To be honest, I only use it to look at the things that my personal friends are up to. I use it to find other kinky people sometimes, or events. But I've been finding it's better to find the kinksters in my safer spaces than it is to try to find people who fit me on FetLife. So, I'll look into my social justice spaces or other spaces, and I'll find the kinksters there, and we'll talk and we'll hang out.
So what are some of those safer spaces? What are some of those other options besides FetLife for meeting fellow kinksters?
Well, if you meet someone on OkCupid and they're awesome and you get along, and you happen to find out that they're kinky also, yay! I mean, that's always great. I just mean communities that have formed around, atheist or feminist or anti-racist identities. So these are not like websites where I could tell somebody to go, but these are, communities that you can get involved with, and sort of, when you get to know everyone, find out who's open and who's kinky and who might want to play with you.
And we're lucky enough to live in a part of the country where there's a couple of regular events here that are put on by social justice-oriented people. Like there's a specific pansexual dungeon in the Los Angeles area, and we know some of the people who operate that. And that's generally where I prefer to talk to people about kink in general, is people I already know or people who are related to people I already know, because it keeps the opportunity for harassment very low, especially if it's someone who I can punch in real life.
You have to ask first.
So Dan, your experiences with other spaces where people can meet people and establish those relationships.
Well, whether you use FetLife or Color Me or the BDSM subgroup on Reddit, doesn't really matter. The reality of it starts when you leave sitting in front of our computer and go meet with actual other human beings. Like Sheba had mentioned, a munch is a low-pressure, generally in a vanilla setting or a non-threatening, a non-kink setting, your local Panera Bread social room. We have munches at a bar called Spoons over here sometimes, where you can just get to start meeting other people. I think that regardless of your interactions online, whether how positive or negative they are, exploring kink actually requires you to start meeting some other people and doing it in safe places. And that's where I would recommend people take that next step.
So Dan and Sheba, I'll direct this to you. As people that have put on large-scale events or been involved with that, what steps do you take as organizers to say, here's how we're going to help make this a safer space?
Sheba?
I just saw a bus coming, Dan. Thanks. So what steps are we taking to make it a safe space? Lots, actually. We do orientations for first-timers, letting them know what is okay and what is not okay in the space. We make sure that everyone signs a waiver so that they know what the rules are. If at any time someone's consent is broken in any type of heinous way, we cut the bands of the people who are involved, and they are not welcome back at our events. We do our best to keep it a very safe, very drama-free environment for everyone to seek out whatever it is that makes them happy, whatever it is that brings them sexual fulfillment.
Dan, anything you'd add to that?
Me too. That's what we do too. And it's pretty much the same idea, right? We also, one of the things that we've done, and some other groups don't do this, but I know it's true for Adventures in Sexuality as well, is we don't allow bars as part of the event. Now, there's a couple of cons that we go to where Barfleet comes to mind, where drinking is a big part of it, and that's great. But when you start mixing alcohol with consent, you're really asking for a challenging situation to develop itself. So that's one of the things we do, and we let people know who the staff people are, and we have a lot of staff people running around at all times. We also ask people. It's really important that if you come up with a situation where you feel that you're being harassed, either at a very minor level or something more significant, you have to let us know about it so that we can act. There's nothing more frustrating than finding out 4 days later, having someone post, "Oh boy, I went to your event and so-and-so didn't make me feel safe." And for us to respond to it at that point can be very challenging, but give us that opportunity to respond then. We want it to be safe. We want you to get there and to be your authentic self. And for you to be your authentic self, you've really got to be able to let your hair down. We want it to be a safe space, and we do what we can to make that happen for you.
So anything else we want to talk about on the topic of safety or consent, especially for an audience that is kind of dipping their toe in the pool of kink?
Well, yeah, kind of piggybacking off what Dan said, unfortunately, sort of being hesitant or reticent at all to assert your boundaries will not serve you very well in most kink spaces. People expect you to sort of aggressively state and enforce your boundaries, and this is something I didn't expect because, the way I was raised and socialized, you're supposed to be polite, but politeness really takes a back seat on the kink scene. You really have to sort of say, these are my boundaries, this is okay, this is not okay, right then and there, and sort of be aggressive about enforcing it, because no one else is going to do it for you. And people aren't necessarily going to be as careful as you'd hope they would be.
I think that's important in any phase of your life, though. You have to be the advocate for yourself. No one else has to live your life. Only you do. So you should know going into it what you're not comfortable with and what you want to happen in a situation. If you're unsure, ask questions. No one is going to give you, a hard time if you are new and you just want a question answered. We actually have what we call a new to kink meeting that we started doing about 2 years ago because of the influx of people who are coming into kink. And these meetings happen once a month. We do it at a local restaurant in their back room. We have a series of 4 meetings, each one of them discussing a different aspect of what can be expected when you come out into a kink world. What kind of things you could run into, that it's okay to say no, that it's just as okay to say yes. We give them the tools that they need in order to negotiate and in order to make sure that they are doing that and advocating for themselves.
Well, I mean, we can say it's just like any other part of life, but I mean, I've never had a situation in my life where I'm half dressed and some lady's following me around calling me sweet cinnamon skin. That has never happened to me outside of a kink context. This woman just insisted on calling me sweet cinnamon, and I didn't know what to do about it because we weren't in a scene together, but I hadn't consented to her fetishizing my skin either. So, we can say it's just like any other part of life, but in a kink context, being in your underwear, you barely know anyone, and someone's running around calling you something and thinking she's being nice about it, even though you're becoming very uncomfortable. That's not normally a situation where I would have to say, "Hey, stop fetishizing my skin." Like, that's not going to happen outside of a kink context. So, yeah.
I don't know. If that were to happen to me at a local mall, I think I would turn around and tell that person, "You're making me very uncomfortable. Please leave me alone." And I don't see why that has to be any different in a kink situation. You have to be nice. You have to be polite. You are a gentle person first. But you are a human being who has feelings and who doesn't deserve to be treated like that. So you just turn around and you say, "You're making me uncomfortable. I'd like you to stop that." And if they don't, you do the things that Dan was talking about, where you make sure that you go and tell a staff person at whatever event it is that's happening at, and you make sure that they know, this person is making me uncomfortable. If it continues, I'm going to need someone from your staff to talk to them about it.
I think that's easy to say, unfortunately, when you're very experienced. When you're new, it can be sort of hard to say, "No, stop doing that" to somebody. And I've been accused of kink shaming for asserting my boundaries, so I have a lot of hesitancy to assert myself in kink spaces. But that's a conversation I'm sure that could go on forever.
So, so yeah, clearly there's a lot of ground to cover as far as consent, how to make spaces safe and safer, some of the underlying difficulties that our society as a whole has that manifests itself within the kink scene. But I do want to go ahead and transition to some of the nuts and bolts of kink, as far as collars, implant elements, ways of actually doing this. And I'll get started with collars. What is kind of the meaning or significance of somebody wearing a collar?
Well, it's important to recognize that some people are simply wearing a collar as a fashion statement. So if I see someone wearing a collar, to not make assumptions. But in the kink setting, what it would normally stand for is that you have some bond to another human being. You have some relationship with them. It may be, and what kind of relationship, I have no clue from just looking at the collar itself, but it does, in your normal kink settings, it's a recognition. I have a relationship with someone else where there's a hierarchical relationship, and I'm not running that relationship.
Anything else anyone would add as to kind of the meaning, or what would go into someone's decision to say, I want to wear a collar? A collar is part of this relationship.
I know a lot of people use the collar as kind of a personal ritual for putting themselves in the headspace of being in a kink environment. Like they're one person outside of their kink environment, whether it's their bedroom or a dungeon or whatever, and when they put on the collar, they're a different person. They're shedding all the responsibilities and stuff that they have outside of that space. And the collar is their way of marking it not only to themselves but to everyone else that they've entered this other headspace. And
he's talking about me.
Not just you. A lot of people. I've gone to Ren Fair. Like half the people there. That's what they wear collars for. But yeah, so the collar is also a constant reminder, because if you move your head, you feel it. If you move your neck, you feel it. If you breathe too deeply, you feel it. So it's constantly there reminding you of the situation that you're in. And it keeps pulling you back to the headspace that you've associated with that collar. So it's just like any other thing. Like people who put on sports jerseys, they get in the sports mindset. People who, like put on their gi for martial arts training, they get in their martial arts mindset. You put on your collar, you get in your kink mindset.
Mm-hmm.
You're ready to be spanked.
Gotcha. So, what's kind of the price range on collars, or someone's like, oh, that's something I'm interested in. Where would they get started on obtaining one?
Oh, wow. I know at our larger events, we have vendors that come in that specialize in kink gear like this, and collars can range you from anywhere from a simple $5 dog collar that you get at PetSmart to, hundreds and hundreds of dollars depending on what you want in your collar and what your price range is.
This panel is sponsored by PetSmart. So, any tips for the beginner on somebody who is thinking, okay, let me add this to my kinky relationship, stuff they should be aware of when it comes to collars?
Well, I would say that you're probably going to go through a couple of collars before you find the one. It's one thing to really admire how a collar looks or even how it feels in your hands, and another to actually wear it out playing and seeing how you feel with it. And, you can have multiple collars. I mean, I know people who buy chokers and really elaborate chokers and sort of use them as collars. I think it just really depends on you, and test driving a few options, if that's in your budget, is probably going to be the best option for figuring out what you like.
And it's almost like searching for a ring with a partner. If you're going to get into a traditional marriage situation, when you make the commitment to one of your partners and you decide to go into a power relationship that involves some type of outward symbolism like a collar, traditionally you go together and pick that out, or the dominant in that relationship goes and finds something that pleases their eye, that makes them very happy when they look and see their collar on you.
I think more important than anything is to know how you react to certain materials. Things like untreated leather on the inside of some collars, being lined with certain kinds of cotton. Like, know what you're allergic to, know what bothers your skin. You're going to be wearing this a lot. You're going to be sweating in it. It's going to possibly abrade your neck. You want to make sure you have something that is not going to leave you uncomfortable when you're in your daily life because you've been wearing your collar for too long, and especially not something that leaves you with like a rash or a skin disorder.
All right, so the next category I've got on my notes are impact implements. So anybody want to talk about their preferred options in that particular arena?
Literally anything.
That's true, because actually, especially people who are just starting out in kink, you can go to your local dollar store or your local large chain hardware store and find all kinds of fun implements that you can use for impact. You don't have to spend tons and tons of money to get the really fabulous toys and really great paddles and the leather floggers and things like that until you know that there's something that you like. So start small. Start with the little things. Start with a spatula. Start with, you know, a nice
Those things sting.
piece of wood.
You know what stings? Giant pixie sticks. Those hurt a lot more than you think they do.
Oh, the giant Twizzlers are a real treat too.
No,
wow, I need to be taking notes for next weekend. Okay, so
one thing I would add for the budget conscious, especially when you're first starting out. So in addition to pervertibles, which is what I like to call the things that we take and make dirty. Also, another option is to look at medical supplies, because I was looking for a Wartenberg pinwheel on kink sites, and they were like $40. I went on eBay and I got 3 for $10 from a medical site, and so that was, and they're the same thing. Additionally, if you volunteer at kink events, which I've done, events that have vendors, when the vendors are unloading and you help them out, when they're loading up again, they often just want to get rid of things, so they might cut you a deal, or they might have an item that has, like, you know, a pinhole of damage on the handle somewhere where no one can see it anyway, and they'll give it to you for like $20. So that's another way to save some money and yet get some good toys out of it.
Speaking of money, though, there's a couple of things in the impact arena you really don't want to skimp on as far as like material and workmanship. Canes, for instance, don't use walking canes. Don't use eskrima sticks. Don't use anything that is meant for supporting people or for hurting people. Like, get kink canes, because you're probably going to break a bone if you don't. Like, the other things, they're not designed for striking people with, or they are designed for striking people with, but more in like a lethal way rather than a fun way, and that can become a problem. Same thing with whips, like what I mentioned about collars earlier and untreated leather. If you have a poorly made flogger made out of untreated leather or rawhide, that can degrade, it can rot, which is great when you pull out your flogger and it smells terrible and pieces of it start falling off. You don't have to spend a lot of money, but you do want to look for like quality craftsmanship, because yeah, you could get a bunch of $20 floggers, or you can spend $130 and get one really nice flogger you'll never have to get rid of. But for like most impact implements, like, go get paddles or something from your local Dick's Sporting Goods.
Dan, anything you'd add on impact implements?
I would actually suggest that you do practice a little bit of caution when we play with pervertibles. I have had many a thing that I thought would be a great spanking implement that ended up breaking in the middle of a scene. Splinters in an ass is not something my partner consented to, and it makes you look pretty dumb when suddenly the thing you've got in your hand goes splintering, and you're trying to instill some confidence, and that doesn't do it. I am not a big...
Awesome.
Exactly. Or do you play it off that I meant to do that? So that's something to keep in mind as well.
Yeah. All right. So the next broad category, restraints. Options for that. Recommendations for that.
Can I go with a negative recommendation, which is handcuffs, like metal handcuffs? The padded ones are okay, but metal handcuffs, at least if you're just starting out, you're probably going to cut your wrist open, because you don't know how much you can really pull against those until you've tried, and you hurt yourself every time. Like, start with like sheepskin cuffs. They're only a little bit more expensive. Use rope, or really anything that isn't made of metal that's wrapped around your wrist. Also, now that we've brought it up, and I know this is in the notes for later, but don't use the restraint techniques that you see in popular movies like 50 Shades of Grey. You will lose that hand. It will lose blood flow and it will fall off dead. I'm not even exaggerating. This has happened to people. Like, look up knots. There are books. There are free things on the internet that show you how to wrap so you don't hurt yourself. Use comfortable slip knots. You know, make sure you go through safety precautions when tying up your partner first, so that you're not, you know, there at 3 in the morning, totally naked, explaining to the paramedics why their hand is black.
As far as restraints, you can get some really nice, inexpensive, like padded leather restraints, and you can usually get them in any color you want. I prefer hot pink. You can get them wrist and ankle to match. But as far as like handcuffs and things like that, another detriment to using those is if the person that you're playing with on the top side doesn't have the handcuff key, that could lead to some really uncomfortable situations.
Yeah,
Guilty
save the
and
handcuffs.
charged.
What's that, Dan?
I was just saying guilty as charged. I don't know if you were talking about me specifically, but you were.
No, I was actually talking about another presenter out there who I won't give out his name, but he did leave me in a dungeon space, hooked up with handcuffs, and had to ask the dungeon monitor to watch me while he ran back up to his room to get his handcuff key.
Okay. So,
I'm not
Anita,
mentioning any names. Scott Smith. I'm not mentioning any names at all.
So that goes to show, if you want to be a presenter, learn how to pick locks first. It's not hard.
Valuable life skills.
And I was going to say from the bottoming side of things, the benefits of cuffs. They can be leather. They also sell artificial ones for people who have animal rights concerns. But the feeling of having your wrists and ankles bound can often, just like wearing a collar, sort of give you that feeling of I'm bound, even if you aren't bound to anything. You know, just wearing them can put you in that headspace. So much recommended.
Well, and I want to riff on that thought as far as kind of the general question of why someone would consider kink. You know, what's the benefit from being in that sort of headspace where you feel restrained or you're feeling this? Why do this in the first place? Why not just stick with the vanilla stuff?
Well, are you having fun with the vanilla stuff? Do you want to have more fun? Like, why do you have sex? Like, it seems like a pretty simple question to me, because it's like, if you think it will be fun, give it a go. I mean...
For me, you know, traditional sexual activity, as it were, it's great, it's awesome, you know, I'm not knocking it. I practice it regularly. But kink is its own thing where it puts me in a different headspace. When I'm topping somebody, this sort of side of me comes out. I cackle in a way that is very reminiscent of a Disney villainess. I sort of get a little bit mean and fun, and it's very different from just, you know, having traditional sex. And then on the bottoming end, you know, I get this sort of feeling of peace afterwards that I could not get from traditional sexual activity. And during the act itself, you know, there's pain, yes, quote unquote, that's the sensation, but what my body is reading it as is really just almost like a sensual sensation, even if someone else watching it will be going, oh gosh, her skin is red and welty, how could she be enjoying that?
I think one of the main reasons that I enjoy expressing myself through kink is that I feel really connected to another human being when I'm doing this in a way that I just can't do sitting down and having a coffee, or even having just a general vanilla sexual experience. You get deep into the heart of another person when you allow those parts of yourself out that you traditionally think of as of the monsters in your closet, the things you have to hide from another person because they might be scary. Being able to do that in a safe and healthy way has allowed me to express myself as a genuine, authentic human being, and it frees me up in the rest of my life as well to know that I have that space where I can do these things.
I was absolutely going there, that vulnerability that it builds. Another aspect that we haven't talked about so far is BDSM in general, believe it or not, is in a safer sex modality. You won't get too far in, at least at, like, for example, when we go to Cope later, every PlayStation next to it will have gloves. We'll have cleaning solution. There's an expectation that you're keeping your toys and your PlayStations clean and well cared for. There's people walking around looking out for you, called DMs or dungeon monitors, keeping an eye on things. And granted, it's not 100% safe, but it certainly is a way that I can express myself sexually that provides an aspect that is the safer sex modality. I'm not messing around with the necessarily bodily fluids. Again, some of our play may involve blood, but a lot of the safety is considered, looked at, and built in. You know, it's one of the first conversations we have, and I get a very clear interaction with you. We'll start off by saying, I want to do this, I want it to go here, and that's about what I want. And we can have this clean negotiation and involve ourselves directly with each other that in such a way that we wouldn't be allowed to outside of a BDSM environment.
Hey, Russell here. I've been hosting this panel, but you haven't heard from me yet. And I was looking for questions in chat, and there haven't been many, but I have one as an outsider to this panel. And that is going back to something that Hina said earlier about being a person of color and sort of fetishized, and the solution offered by the rest of the panel was to basically you should be firm about setting your boundaries. But I wonder if that is a challenge for a lot of submissive people who may want to be submissive in a kink context, but may have a difficult time expressing ways of standing up for themselves when their boundaries are crossed. I mean, is it difficult to assert your boundaries if you are put in a submissive situation?
I don't know if that necessarily is the issue. I think the issue in the situation that I described was that somebody started engaging in their fetish with me without asking me first. That was really the issue. And because it wasn't a traditional scene, it wasn't like we were playing together and she just started talking at me. I guess maybe she didn't realize that she was essentially roping me into her fetish without getting my consent first. So I think it really is on people who initiate these scenes or initiate any kind of interaction or play in a sort of fetishy or kinky way to make sure that the other person is actually on board with it, rather than just sort of start and wait for them to say no.
Right. Well, I mean, I would just point out that every single person on this panel is the kind of person who likes to get in front of a camera and talk, so they tend maybe a little more assertive than your average person, but I'm just wondering if there's a risk of having a sort of blame the victim culture when there are dom-sub relationships going on, and the sub might not be so good at standing up for themselves as the people here would be.
I think it's one of the reasons why it's really important that groups need to look at having new to kink classes for people who are brand new to this, so that they can hear that that these things sometimes can happen, and that you are okay to stand up for yourself. And not only that, but it also, I mean, it's for the dominants in that situation as well, so that they can learn not to be a dick, because it's really important not just to say that it's the submissive who needs to set the boundaries and negotiations. The person who is the top in any situation has their own boundaries and needs to negotiate and advocate for themselves as well, without being an asshole about it. Oops, am I allowed to say asshole?
Yeah, it's okay.
This is YouTube. There is no such thing as the SEC. Or, no, I'm sorry.
FTC.
Which one is it? FTC.
Another thing I would like to say, too, is that, you know, in communities, I mean, I feel like a lot of times with kinksters, we tend to be like, oh, everyone knows about consent. We're all tired of talking about consent. But, you know, reinforcing that consent narrative is important, too, you know, in situations, and reminding people that, hey, don't wait for a no, get your yes first. That's important.
All right, well, I think we're running right up against the end of the time that we have. So, Russell, you can say no to this. Do we have time to get closing thoughts from the panelists?
Oh, yes, go ahead.
All right.
I realized that was a question for me.
Sheba, we'll start with you. I'll suggest what one public misconception about kink would you most want would go away?
That we all wear tight, like, leather outfits, that we're all like a BDSM Barbie who can fit into your fetishized box of what a dominant female looks like. I wish that shit would just go away.
All right. Dan, for you, what would you most want to go away?
That there's any one true way to do kink, that you can go to someone and say, what's the right way to do it, and they'll have an actual answer for you. The best thing they'll be able to do is say, here's how I do it.
Danny?
I wish that people would stop assuming that kink is actually always about sex. Sometimes it's not actually about sex. It's got nothing to do with penetration or getting off or whatever. It's got its own kind of thing going on, and it can be fun that way. It can be fun just to, you know, dress cute and be teasing or whatever. It doesn't have to actually lead towards people having orgasms and being exhausted.
Ina?
That if somebody who is a woman, or you think is a woman, says that they're kinky, that it means she'll take it up the ass. That is basically it. To me, my asshole is another orifice. It's not kinky. It's just another orifice. But if that's your kink, that's fine.
But get consent first and specifically talk about that before.
But I mean, but you know, and also I think a lot of men who, like, in a dating context will hear that I don't say I'm kinky a lot necessarily, because they'll just assume that I'll have sex with anybody for any reason in any way, and that I will accommodate all of their kinks. And they forget I may have kinks of my own that I want to indulge in.
All right. Well, thank you to everybody for being a part of this. Really appreciate your time, your perspective, and your expertise. So, thanks everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I hope you don't
Thank
mind.
you.
Quick plug. In an hour and a half, I'm going to be doing the Secular Cults panel with Adam Lee, Karen Stolznow, and Vicky Garrison, and Angie.
Lots of great stuff going on in FtBCon. Check lanyard for that. So, all right. Thanks everybody.
Bye.
Bye.